All right, so today we're going to cover how to get something out of ZBrush, like a Spongebob model, and make it bounceable and collidable, and then maybe turn that into a foam object, and again, have it bounceable and collidable. Of course, where I started making this was in ZBrush, and I'll probably do a live stream on the creation process of this character. It's pretty simple. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop right into Cinema 4D, because there's going to be some kind of setup stuff that I'm going to talk about that's going to influence how we create our ZBrush model and what we bring in from ZBrush to Cinema 4D to make it usable. Now, before we get too far in, the whole reason I was even investigating foam was for a liquid simulation I was trying to get through. And then I kind of went down the rabbit hole, and that got me into soft body collision with kind of a foam volume builder look. One thing that I found super helpful was this video here. So I'm going to have this linked in my description. This is by Zach, the foam material in Redshift part 2. That also goes into a lot of dynamic simulation as well. It's going to have a very similar setup. We're going to deviate a little bit when we get into displacement maps. But again, a very good video, so go check that out. Now, to kind of explain what we're going to be doing, I'm going to go in here to create mesh primitives plane, and we're just going to put a plane right on the ground. Go ahead and hit T so we can scale this up. And to scale uniformly, you just grab out here in the empty area and just pull, and then I'll go ahead and scale all this this mesh out. And then again, we'll go in here to create mesh primitive, and we'll drop a cube in our scene. Hit E, and we'll just raise this up above the ground, and we'll tilt it a little bit just so when we start dropping this on the ground, you'll see it do something. Now, if I was to drop this plane or this cube on the ground right now, it wouldn't do much because there's not a whole lot of geometry here. Now, if we go in here to display shading with lines, you're going to see it's just one line. So let's go ahead, and with this object selected, we'll say segments, and we'll just type in 3 and hit tab. And now we've got it subdivided on all sides 3 times. So now let's go ahead and just drop this on the ground. And in order to do that, it's super simple. I'm just going to click this plane, right click, go into bullet tags, and make that a collider body. That means it's just going to be a static body that sits there and things can run into it. It knows it's there. Then I'm going to select my cube or go up here, right click the cube, say bullet tags, and we're going to make this a soft body. Just right off the bat, if we have the cube selected, we've added a new dynamics body tag to it. And that's also this little tag right here. So you can click that, go over here to soft body. Here's all of your soft body settings. And right at the top here, you're going to see soft body is made of polygons and lines. If you click this drop down menu and turn that off, it's now a rigid body. And in fact, if we delete this tag out of here, go in here to cube, bullet tags, rigid body. It's got a different icon. It's got a little bowling ball there, but you're going to see it's still called soft body in this little area here with that tag selected, and its soft body is turned off. If we made this of polygons lines, now it's a soft body. So just in case you get confused there, that's all that's going on. But again, I'm going to right click, bullet tags, make that a soft body. And now that I've done that, all I have to do is go into my scene here, click play. It'll fall on the ground and kind of bounce as it hits the floor. You can hit this back button here. You're going to see the hotkey for that is Shift F. And then again, to step through frames, it's F and G on your keyboard. So Shift F to go all the way back to the beginning, and then F and G to go just kind of step through frames forward and backwards. I'm going to go ahead and take this object. We'll move it up just a little bit more, and we'll go ahead and go to display, just turn on regular shading. And then again, we can hit play, and you'll see it bounce and kind of hit the ground, and we're good to go. Let's hit Shift F to reset our scene here. Let's introduce another object. So we'll go in here to create mesh primitives sphere. We'll just take the sphere and we'll move it up even higher. And if I was to go ahead and hit play, the sphere is just going to sit there. It has no tag telling it that it's supposed to be an animated body. So we're going to have that sphere selected. We're going to right click in here, and instead of a soft body, we'll just give it a rigid body. So that way the ball is not going to bounce around or anything. It's going to be more like a bowling ball, which incidentally is also what that tag looks like when it's a rigid body. So if we hit play now they'll both fall. The soft body will bounce and the ball will hit it and kind of bounce off there. Now, of course, there's a bunch of parameters that we can change. So on the soft body here, we're going to go back to our cube, hit the soft body, and because the last place we were at was the soft body section, but there is a dynamic section over here on the left. One of the things that's going to come up later is the trigger selection. It's set to immediately by default, which means whenever you hit play, it's just going to start behaving as a soft body. Instead, I want this, in this case, let's say we want this to only be triggered once something hits it or interacts with it. So I'm going to say on collision. So that way when I hit play, the sphere is going to drop, boom, hits the cube, and then the cube drops. Of course, if you don't want that, you can switch that back to immediately, and then it'll just start simulating as soon as you hit play. There's also collision settings in here. One thing I'm going to bring to your attention early is the shape automatic. We're not going to change that right now, but when we get to more complex shapes, we're going to change this from automatic to moving mesh. And there's even more things you can play in here like bounce and friction. But for the most part, over here in the soft body settings is where you're going to be making most of your changes to get that kind of jiggly feel for your soft body that you're looking for. But I'm going to show you something that's going to make a huge impact on how your soft body behaves, and one of those is scale, and we're just going to maintain our scale here, but I am going to go in here to back to display and line shading, but I'm going to increase the polygon density of our cube. So we're going to go back into our cube, go in here to object. Instead of 3 segments, let's crank this up to 10, and instead of hitting tab, let's just select all 3 of these over here. We'll type in 10 and then control enter, and that'll give us 10 on both sides. Now I haven't changed any soft body settings. If we go here to soft body, nothing has changed. However, if I go in here and hit play now, you're going to see when it hits, it just kind of collapses. And all we've done is add more geometry. So the more geometry you add, and hit Shift F to go back to the beginning frame, the more calculations that are going to have to take place to maintain these relationship between points. If you only have a very few points, then it doesn't have to calculate as much, and those calculations go much faster, and it'll maintain its integrity really consistently. However, the more geometry you add, the more you'll have to probably end up playing with this to get the look you want. And this kind of goes back, we hop back into ZBrush, if we go in here to geometry, this right here is 140,000 polygons. You know, it's ZBrush, you can handle all sorts of geometry here. However, I wouldn't want to really necessarily simulate 140,000 polygons. It'd be very intense. And in fact, you know, if I drop down to subdivision level 1, this is what I actually am going to end up simulating. And again, we're talking like a 6x2 cube, very, very low res with a little nose sticking out. I think even subdivision level 2, if I say delete lower, that's like a 12x4, probably doable. It's not a huge deal. But again, I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. So this is what I'm going to end up bringing in and simulating. Now, if we hop back over into Cinema 4D, obviously when this thing hits the ground, I don't want it to just collapse on the ground and have the ball fall on it. I want it to, you know, bounce like it did before. Now, there's going to be a couple different things that I'm going to need to do. And my knee-jerk reaction is to really like crank the structural or crank the stiffness. And you can do that if we go in here and say, okay, give me a structural of 200. And structural, again, wants to maintain those relationships between points. And if you give it more structural integrity, it's going to increase those, it's going to maintain those relationships better. If we go down here to stiffness, we'll say stiffness of 5. And let's say this object was made out of hidden little invisible springs that are creating the relationships between those points. The higher the stiffness, the stiffer those springs are. The lower the stiffness, the more relaxed they are. So just those 2 settings we can go through here and we'll get a slightly different result. You know, it's a little bouncier. It hits the ground. Not quite as hard, I suppose. But let's go ahead and hit Shift F. And before I really start cranking these settings, there's just a couple more things I want to change. And it's not in the soft body settings, it's not in the collision settings, although you can play with that bounce a little bit. And it's not in the dynamic settings of the actual tag. What I'm going to have to do is hit Control D, which is Edit Project Settings. And your project settings is going to open right here and with a little attributes tab here. So this is the settings for our entire project. And you see we have a little bullet section in here. And by default, it's going to go to General. If you want to do like a slow-mo simulation, you can change the time scale. If you want gravity to be heavier or not at all, you can change gravity to 0 and it'll just be floating in space. But where I want to go is this little expert tab. And there's some really interesting things in here. So number 1 is collision margin. I'll show you what that means in just a second. And it may not actually be that relevant to the scene we're working with, but it will come into play later on. We have more complex objects. But right down here, steps per frame and then maximum solver iterations per step. This is similar. I'm going to hop back into ZBrush and let's go in here and I'm going to turn off this head and we'll select the body base here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to insert a plane and I'm going to rotate this plane around. So it's just going to lay up here flat and I'm going to scale it in just a little bit so we can see on both sides. If I go in here to polyframe, I want nice even quads. I'm going to let ZRemesher do the heavy lifting for me. So under geometry, ZRemesher, I would say half. Adaptive size down to 0, nice even quads, hit ZRemesher, and there we go. So I want to simulate this object down onto this body. Now in Cinema 4D, I would make this a collider body, but all we need to do in ZBrush is have this one selected, go in here to do our dynamics menu, and then we're going to turn on collision volume. So if this object's selected, this is our object we want to simulate, and anything else that's visible in our scene is going to turn into a collision volume. So now if I go over here and run the simulation, it'll drop down on my object, and there's not quite enough geometry to support it actually falling over this. So I'm going to hit Control Z. I'm going to go in here to geometry, divide. That'll give me more resolution. So now when I run the simulation, it'll go ahead and fall over. and we can see the result. So now if I zoom in, you're going to see this plane is it's just off a little bit from the object here. If I go over here to collision volume, I can take this inflate down to say 0.25, and then if I hit Control Z and then run the simulation again, you're going to see it's going to get closer to the object. Let me go ahead and hit Control D one more time to subdivide once, and then run the simulation. There we go. So now it's getting, the simulation is dropping it, and it's getting closer to the actual collision object. So if I hop over to Cinema 4D, I think that's the same thing as collision margin. You can lower this down and objects will be, they won't have any padding between them. Now down here where it says steps per frame and then maximum solver iterations per step, back here in ZBrush, and let's go ahead and hit delete lower so you can see the actual geometry. If I go through here and then, actually let's change this shader so you can see a little bit better. If I run the simulation now, it's going to hit the object, and you see how it really stretches that object. As it's falling, it's having a hard time maintaining those relationships. However, if I hit Control Z and I go up here to the simulation iterations and I crank this all the way to the right, it's going to run it's going to run slower because it's running more calculations per frame, but because it's running more calculations per frame, it's able to maintain those relationships much more accurately. Now, speed is a factor, so I could actually turn this back down to 100, drop my gravity down quite a bit. So as I run the simulation, well, maybe not that much, drag the gravity down less than 10, and then if you let the simulation run slower, it'll actually have more time to run these little calculations and maintain those relationships. Or you can just, in ZBrush, you can do it manually. You can go to BTC, which is transpose cloth, and you can literally control, if you go very slowly, it's going to have, it's going to allow all those calculations to run because you're not moving very fast per frame. If I go very quickly, it'll stretch the heck out of it because it's those calculations happening in the blink of an eye aren't enough to maintain those relationships. But again, the more simulation iterations, the more calculations it's running per frame or per second, the more accurate it's going to be. So if we hop back over into Cinema 4D, same thing here. If we want to give it time to do a more accurate simulation, it's going to, again, be a little bit slower because it's doing more calculations. We can say, you know, let's do 10 steps per frame and then 20 iterations a step. So now when I hit play, that's going to give it more time to run those calculations, and now it's getting a little more of its bounce back. It's not sticking or collapsing anymore. So let's hit Shift F. Let's go now into our cube settings, our soft body here. So now I won't have to go in here to the structural and crank that up super high to get the look I'm going for. And again, if we turn this down, that's going to make it even more jiggly. So less structural integrity between. So now it's got a more bouncy object. And while you're going through here and exploring these other options, you can just right click, say for example, damping, go into max on help, and it'll tell you damping is a degree of oscillation of the structure spring. So over here in the structural component, maintaining that structural integrity, the greater the value, the faster the oscillating of those springs will end. So basically when you bounce a spring and it kind of jiggles for a minute, the higher the value, the less it's going to jiggle, right? So if you want to change all three dampings at once, you can go hold down Control and click all these dampings. So it's at 20% now. Let's change this to 55, hit Control Enter to change all three that you have selected. And then now when this goes, it should be a slightly less jiggle result. Let's go ahead and hit Shift F. And I didn't honestly mind the jiggle, so I can go back in here and we'll just change that back to 20 and hit Control Enter. Now, of course, while you're running simulations, you can always feel free to, run the simulation and see, oh, okay, that worked pretty good. You can hit Shift F, you can move the ball around, you can move a little bit more forward. So now when you hit play, you'll get a slightly different result. It'll bounce off the back end here. And then one thing I want to check, I don't know if it'll make much of a difference. Let's hit Shift F. Again, in this particular case, I'm going to take this ball, I'm going to go in here to segments and type in like 64. And then I'm going to hit play, and then as it hits, I'm going to pause it, I'm going to go look. Yeah, it looks like it's fine. There's a little bit of padding in here, and with our object set to auto, it seems to be working okay. All right, so now that we have a very basic understanding, and by, I've only been using Cinema 4D for like, a couple weeks, so very basic on my part, but, thanks to YouTube, and I go by Zach, a little bit better understanding. But let's head back into ZBrush and figure out how we can get, again, we'll go over here and turn on our head displacement, how we get this detailed head out of ZBrush and still be able to go simulate it in Cinema 4D effectively. And that's going to be with displacement maps.